What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality?
This is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people who are exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. Now, those of us in the network have many different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see diversity as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. If you'd like to know more about the network, please visit our website, diversityandspirituality.com. Today, it's my privilege to interview David Campt, a nationally recognized expert in the areas of inclusion and equity, stakeholder engagement, conflict resolution, and dialogue. David's done a lot of things in these areas, including organizing nationally televised meetings for then President Obama, addressing 1,000 foundation executives on the importance of civic engagement, and facilitating conversations about race among small groups of members of Congress. He's the author of several books about distilling the wisdom of groups, including The Little Book of Dialogue for Difficult Subjects and Read the Room for Real, How a Simple Technology Creates Better Meetings. I first became aware of David's work just prior to the recent presidential election when he was organizing what was called Americans Listen, which is a project that brought people together from different sides of the political spectrum to basically have conversations. We'll talk about that and David's most recent project, the White Allies Toolkit, in a moment. But let's get started. David, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
David, I know a lot of your work has involved creating ways for people to speak across political divides, and I'm thinking particularly of the Americans Listens project, which of course is a little bit in the rearview mirror, in which you brought together people from different sides of the political spectrum to engage in listening to one another. So I don't know anything about your religious and spiritual background, but I'm wondering, what is it in your background that has caused you to be a peacemaker, or one whose work involves people helping people find common ground?
I think that the origin of that is my upbringing in Detroit. I'm old enough to have been alive for the big riot in '67. We were precocious and had it before everybody else had it in '68 in Detroit. And I don't remember it, but I remember my mom telling me that I was hiding under the bed as tanks rolled down the street. And certainly I do remember through the course of the next several years, after we moved to a different area, we were about the third Black family in the area. 10 years later, it was 50% Black. So I remember the tumult, the divisions in Detroit. And I remember having a fourth grade teacher, Mr. Nathan Fine, who would always tell us, people are more alike than they are different. So I think, that struck me. And I think that was in stark contrast. What he was trying to remind us is that despite the battles in the press that we might be observing even as fourth or fifth graders, the arguments over who was going to control Detroit. You have a mayor, Coleman Young, saying, if you don't like what I'm doing, you can hit 8 Mile Road. He's telling white folks, basically, it's our city now. We remember, I was old enough to remember when he got elected and all the battles over who should control the city. So I think it is within that background, that context of, on the one hand, I have a teacher who's saying people are more alike than they are different. On the other hand, I'm seeing that adults are not acting like that people are emphasizing the differences. I became intrigued by at least two questions. One was, what does it mean for, who controls the government? Who controls the apparatus of institutions? And how does who control that influence what they do? And then the second one is, how do people talk to each other when they look at these kind of questions of self-governance and our vision of the future very differently? So I wound up studying the issue of cultural competence for my dissertation at Berkeley years later. And that has to do with that first question of who controls institutional apparatus and what the difference does it make for what it does. And then also I became interested in the issue of dialogue and how do people have more effective conversations when they might see themselves and the problems they confront differently.
Now, you and I both have been involved in a lot of diversity conversations as trainers, facilitators, speakers. This is a broad question, David, but what is your sense as the right way to engage in these conversations, especially with people that don't share your particular point of view?
The critical thing to do on that is to move the conversation from opinion to experience. In the little book of Dialogue for Difficult Subjects, what I and my co-author, Lisa Schirch, suggest is that there's an arc of a dialogue that when you're trying to grapple with a collective problem. So, and that arc reflects what I just said. So you first need to get people on the same page in terms of what is their intention, why are they there, and establishing positive intention at a high level is important, especially when people have serious disagreements. Then you go to what are our experiences? And the trick from a facilitator standpoint is to raise the question of different experiences that is relevant to why people came to the meeting. So that's a question crafting issue. But from just if you don't have the benefit of being a facilitator nerd like we are, you're just trying to have a conversation, then what you want to do is to have a conversation that is about not just what we believe, but what are the experiences that we've had that led to our beliefs. So you're getting people to exchange experiences. That has a few different benefits. One of the benefits is having people share stories about their experiences is much more connecting than have people talk about their opinion. You can refute somebody's opinion, but it's harder to refute their experience. So you want to move the conversation on that level. It also is the case that, and I only learned this recently, there's things in our brain called mirror neurons, and our brains get shifted when other people tell us stories and engage us. This is why we cry at movies. This is why we get angry when we read novels and we're identifying with a certain character because we are identifying at a deep level of empathy. So what you're trying to do is shift the conversation from opinion to experience in order to have people tell each other experiences because they identify with each other more. But it is also the case, there's a third thing that happens, at least a third thing, which is that by me looking at what are the experiences that are driving my opinion, I sometimes might revisit my conclusions. Like I sometimes learn from that just from the process of reflecting enough to tell a coherent story. So, and in addition to me doing that just from me, I also hearing from other people who have a very different experience that I might not be familiar with at all. So if you shift the conversation to experience and away from opinion, or through, after opinion a little bit to experience, now you have in front of you a range of experiences, and that's important to, you can use that. And so it's almost like we have the diversity of experiences in front of us. Now we can ask the question, why is it that we have the range of experiences that we have? What are the conditions that are producing very different experiences? And now you're analyzing the problem you came to talk about. Now you're probing that, but through the lens of different experiences. You're not wrong. I'm not wrong. We've all had our experiences. Let's sort out what's going on with that. And from there, you potentially come up with some collective analysis or not. And then you can ask the question, by the way, making sense of your experiences after they're unearthed is phase 3. Phase 4 is what, if anything, might we do with that, right? So to what extent do we have a similar analysis? To what extent is there something for us all to do? And then maybe there is not, or maybe there is. So the point of going through all that is to articulate that we can talk differently, but we have to have a plan. And that plan, in my view, needs to shift to talking about our experiences so we can figure out whether there's something we might do together that's going to build bridges as opposed to build walls.
That is just wonderful. And it's so beautiful. And it calls to mind a point of similarity between the two of us, which you may or may not be aware of. But I know that both of us had some experience at Princeton University. You as a student and me as basically a staff person. And when I was at Princeton, I don't know if you know this, but I started something called dialogue circles. And the hallmark was about experience. So being a middle manager person of color, they would always invite me to these meetings, about diversity, which became quite boring after a while because people had lots of opinions about what was going on. So eventually I called a bunch of people together. I said, I'm sick of this. And I asked people around the table, why are you here? And everybody shared their experience. And as you so articulately identified, there's something about sharing your experiences which gets people out of their head and into that place of connection. And it enabled us to create this kind of, I'll call it kind of an elevator speech, which basically says that exchanging stories creates common ground. So I just love the way that you articulated that. It just touched me and reminded me about that early experience I have. Now, you have a project which I want you to talk about a lot, which I think is very important, and it's called the White Ally Toolkit. And I ask you about that because I am frequently, I come in contact with, white progressives, basically. And the question gets to be, whether it's in an organizational context or whether it's simply a social context, what should I do? I'm progressive. I can see what's going on here. I'm woke. What can I do? I don't know what to do, Angelo. Tell me.
Right.
And I think your White Ally Toolkit, I'm speaking for you here, it gives them actual things to do as opposed to you do your own work, which sounds a little dismissive.
The reason I started the White Ally Toolkit is because I recognize that a whole bunch of people feel just like you do. Like a whole bunch of people of color are tired of fielding that question. And what we do is we tell people, go do your own work. And okay, what does that mean? Like I understand the impulse to say that. It makes sense, but people need some guidance about what that actually means. So the point of the White Ally Toolkit is to give people guidance on what that means. So that can mean a lot of different things. But one of the things I think is systematically underinvested in from a time standpoint by people who aspire to be allies is talking to their cousins and their mamas and their nieces and nephews and their coworkers and their neighbors. So let's remember what we're talking about. 55% of white people do not think that racism against people of color is any more significant than racism against white people. So essentially, 55% of white people essentially think that racism doesn't exist. Like racism is like sin or illness, or it's like a general condition that happens. So, okay. So 55% of people don't think racism exists. How do we shift that? Well, you're not going to shift that from everybody being in a dialogue group. Like, I believe in dialogue groups. I spent a whole bunch of time in dialogue groups. I believe in dialogue groups. Yay for dialogue groups. But I am not crazy enough to think, let me put it this way. I think that somebody should pay me to massively organize dialogue groups. I could do that. But while I'm waiting for that to happen, I think we need to look at other social change strategies besides everybody getting a dialogue group, much less everybody getting a dialogue group where you got to have people of color in there. People of color need to go to work, but they don't need to be doing something else besides being dialogue groups, as important as that is. So the only way to change that number, that 55%, is we need tens of millions of white-on-white conversations about racism between the 45% of people who think racism is real and the 55% who don't. By the way, in my broad definition of allies, in a broad definition, I consider everybody in that 45% an ally. Now, I know that there's discourse on the left about, I don't want allies, I want advocates, or I want, there's all that. And I get that continuum, but on a broad level, if white person believes that racism is real, as opposed to the 55% who don't, they're an ally. So that's how I'm looking at it. So the question would be, how do the 45% of people who are allies have a conversation with the 55% of people who, let's call them, for the sake of using neutral language, let's call them racism skeptics. I'm not going to call them deniers. I'm going to call them skeptics in case one is listening, because I always call them deniers. I'm just call them skeptics. So how do the 45% talk to the 55% in a way that's effective? So these 45% are coming to us as people of color saying, what do I do? And we get irritated, put our hands on our hips and say, go talk, go deal with your own people or go do your own work. What does that actually mean? So the White Ally Toolkit, whiteallytoolkit.com, is trying to precisely deal with that question. Okay, so you're gonna have those conversations. How do they become effective? Well, one of the things that also is kind of ironic is that the way of engaging people that people of color, who are in the social justice, we model really ineffective strategies for influencing other people. We're judgmental. If people don't understand racism like we do, we judge them. We tell them they're wrong. We're irritated, and we don't want to listen. That is not what we need to do. And we want to blow them away with facts and knowledge, right? So what is that is precisely not what works. Like we know there's something called the backfire effect, which is if you confront people with facts that disagree with their point of view, they usually just double down on their point of view. This is well established. And this is not just conservative people. This is everybody. People do that. So we know that that's true. We also know that the best way to influence somebody is to listen to them first. There's something called the principle of reciprocity when you're trying to influence people. And if you're trying to get them to listen to you, you listen to them first. Now, do we do that as people of color dealing with white people who don't think racism is real? No, we don't do that. We don't listen, and we try to blow them away with facts and concepts. And that doesn't work. And so then we teach these allies to do that. And that's precisely what they don't need to do. And so you get this phenomenon. One of the results of that is you get this whole political incorrectness backlash, which is on some level, that's about many different things. One of the things it's about is people people on the left calling people who are conservative, who are, let's call them racists of skeptics, again, to use neutral language, calling them racist and calling them, and basically calling them a racist because they don't acknowledge racism. Now, I sort of get that, but that is the last thing you need to do if you're trying to actually influence people. So what allies need to do is to understand principles from persuasion science. They need to understand principles of nonviolent communication. And they need to understand that the way to influence people is to listen first and then shift the conversation to an experience-based conversation, right? So actually, I'll say that differently. Ask questions which get at experiences, listen to them, and then share your experiences. So in the toolkit, I suggest that people remember what to do as a basic strategy when people are trying to combat some racially problematic statement. I'd suggest that people do a 4-step process that can be remembered by the acronym RACE, and that means reflect, ask, connect, expand. So reflect. First thing you do is to actually get in a listening mode. Like, what do I have to do to get in a listening mode in this moment? It's important to reflect on that. So if you've reflected before this, and hopefully if you're really serious about being an ally, you do some pre-work. We tell people to get ready for speeches, but we don't tell people to get ready for listening. But that's important to do. So you now reflect on what you need to have to be a good listener, but you also reflect on what are the stories I can bring to bear, right, about a racial topic. Now, that's reflect. Now, I'm going to tell you the stories in a minute. Then you ask. So somebody says, okay, I don't understand why all these people are complaining about police brutality. Everybody knows that if you just act right when the cop stops you, everything will be fine. That's a racially problematic statement. Okay, I'm an ally. I hear that. Now I need to, instead of being mad and being judgmental, and say, this is a moment. This is the moment for me to be an ally. Let me do some reflection. Let me go to the bathroom, take a couple deep breaths so I don't get mad at my cousin, do what I always do, which is to try to tell him he's a racist and he doesn't understand and go off on him. Let me take some deep breaths, calm down, go to the bathroom, remember what I'm going to talk about. One, I'm going to stand listening. A second, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remember 2 different types of stories. So, and I'll tell you those story types in a minute. So you come back and say, well, that's interesting that you say that. Tell me why you think that. And you actually listen to your cousin say why they think that. And then they say, well, okay, that's interesting. Tell me an experience. Don't just tell me the stuff from Fox News you've heard. Tell me an experience that validates your opinion that, cops are fine if you act right. They tell you some experience. They tell you about getting stopped by a cop and it was fine. Okay. Or even seeing a cop encounter with a person of color that was fine. Whatever story they tell you. All right. So then your job is to tell them a story that connects to them, that agrees with some little piece of what they believe. So what can you do on that? Well, if you believe that racism is a real factor, You don't believe it's the only thing in every situation. You probably can talk about some situation in which a cop was good. You can talk about some situation in which somebody, the micro behaviors in a cop encounter either agitated a cop or calmed down a cop. Basically, what your goal is to tell an experience that validates a piece of what the other person believes. That's the connect part. So again, remember, reflect, ask, connect. Tell an experience that connects with them so they don't see you as an enemy. So they don't see you as somebody who's trying to tear down their belief structure. You're relaxing them by doing that. Let that exist between you for a beat, as they might call it in theater. Then you expand. Then you tell them a different experience that suggests that racism is a real thing. So you tell them about your friend that was mistreated, or you tell them about something that you witnessed, or you tell them about some personal experience that is that expands their view and puts on the table, well, yes, racism is not the only thing in the world, but yes, sometimes it matters. So what are you doing now? So now you shift the conversation from opinion to experience, and now you're sharing experiences. So that's a whole, so in the toolkit, we suggest that white allies be ready to do that across a variety of issues. So the story you tell about police abuse is different than when you tell about, those people of color, they cause their own economic problem. Or the story you tell about, so the economic opportunity, that's what I just said. Or, no, racism doesn't exist anymore. Nobody's racist anymore. Or slavery and Jim Crow was a long time ago. Or these people need to stop protesting the flag. Or we need to build a wall to keep those immigrants out, et cetera, et cetera. So the toolkit is structured around, one of the ways it's structured is around all these hot button issues and the problematic statements that racism skeptics make. What do you do in response to that? Well, you get your toolkit together. So you get together, what are the stories I'm going to tell that are personal experiences of mine are as close to that as possible that get you ready for that moment. And so I hope I'm not talking too long, but I wanted to lay out there is a process, there's a structure, and allies can start working on that. Going back to what you asked, they can start that right now. Like they can start working on Hannah and Skylar and Emma, and you insert Brett, you insert your white name here. They can start working right now. They don't have to do a bunch of reading. They don't have to read Cornel West or Jelani Cobb or Michael Eric Dyson. No, they can look at their own personal experiences and get ready to start dealing with their cousins and their mamas and their aunties and their neighbor today with some reflection and thoughtfulness. They can start doing that right now. That's what I tell them.
Well, David, that's beautiful. Now, I want us to take a little step back a little bit because it's occurring to me that we've been using this word dialogue, and I'm not sure that everybody understands exactly what we're talking about. What do you mean by dialogue without getting too technical? And what's its importance? Why is it a sacred thing?
Sure. I guess I would say that dialogue is a process of people exchanging, a process of people communicating that where the goal of the process is to try to examine, to try to put one's beliefs and experiences in front of the other and understand and create understanding from multiple people doing that, to try to examine that collective pot of experiences and beliefs with the idea that nobody has the complete sense of the truth, and that the real truth about the world can be revealed from the collective examination of the collective opinions and experiences. So you're looking, on some level, you're looking at dialogue. One of the signifiers is each person is looking for what's not what's wrong with the other person's point of view, but what's right about it. And that's the big distinguishing factor between dialogue and a more of a debate style of conversation.
Another thing that's implicit in that is that we go into the conversation from a spirit of inquiry as opposed to an adversarial type of thing from the jump.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. You're looking for. It's the difference between dialogue and debate is you're looking for what's right about the other person's perspective, not what's wrong about it. So you use fancy words, inquiry from conflict, but it's the same. It's the same point. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Now, just to shift a little bit. Now, I know years ago, I found David Campt on YouTube, and David gave a talk that was titled the challenge of being a peacemaker. And I spent my 45 minutes, or I think it's actually 20 minutes, listening to that. And it was a very sort of engaging talk that you gave about your background and everything like that. And but it didn't really address the actual question of the statement as to what it was billed as, a challenge of being a peacemaker. So I want to ask you to take a moment and articulate what you feel are the challenges of being a peacemaker in this incredibly fragmented age in which we live.
So I'll see if I can do better than I'm sorry I failed you on that YouTube video.
I was looking for the magic bullet, man.
We'll see if I can do better this time. One of the things that peacemakers have to do is to find the right balance between confidence and humility. So, in a world full of conflict, what peace builders need to make sure that they have the gumption to do is to go into situations of individual or collective conflict and say, hey, I have a vision of how this could be better. Let me tell y'all, let us, I'm going to invite y'all to, you should do this, you should do that. And let's see, that might create a different dynamic. And it's nice to say that, but when people are actually engaged in conflict or it's bubbling up, it takes some gumption to do that and it takes some confidence to do that. So that's one thing. On the other hand, humility is also important because people often understand themselves better. They often understand the situation better. And so it is important to not be so confident that you don't recognize you don't know everything. There's things that you don't know about the individuals involved, the situation, or even about your own motivations. And so there's a tension between confidence and humility that you have to strike. I think that, there are people who they might have good ideas about peace building, but they're not confident enough to assert them. And the bigger problem, though, that is true. The bigger problem is a more common problem, but they're both problems, is people who are so confident of their own wisdom that they think they can solve a situation by telling people what to do. Y'all just need to do this. And they will assert themselves in a situation in which and they're not welcomed, or their advice is not welcome because they're not approaching it with sufficient humility. So that tension is an important thing that peace builders have to manage. And on some level, that's a spiritual issue, I think. So anyway, there's that. A second issue is our analysis. I think that part of and we can see the lack of good analysis and good understanding of what is our collective situation from what is going on with the peace building, with the conflict resolution field in the U.S., and then how much have we affected what happens in schools. So you got tens of millions of children who are either in after-school programs or actually in school who potentially could understand basic concepts of conflict resolution. Conflict resolution can be taught as early as second or third grade. But if we think about if we ask the question, to what extent has a field of conflict resolution, which knows how to deliver those skills, as a field, that knowledge is known, how do you deliver that in age-appropriate ways? How many tens of millions of those children are we touching? How many of those tens of millions of children are we touching? Not that many. So we haven't done a good job as a profession of saying, of making sure that people know these skills, and that becomes a core part of becoming an educated person, even a minimally educated person. And so we're shocked and appalled that by the time people get to the 6th and 7th grade, there's rampant bullying. By the time they get to high school, there's a lot of violence, especially in our urban areas. Well, we haven't equipped people with the tools that we know tend to work to stop that. And so why are we shocked and appalled at that result? So I'm just saying I'm bringing all that up to talk about we have to, in addition to having that confidence humility thing I mentioned a minute ago, we have to have a serious analysis of our collective situation, and to bring that analysis to bear systemically, so we can look at, okay, what needs to happen broader than me as a peace builder helping Jamal and Edward not fight. What do we need to bring to the situation so that Jamal and Edward don't get into that fight, that they know how to de-escalate. They know how to not let that situation get worse. So I would just say that those two things, balancing humility and confidence, and then having a systemic analysis that is sharp and that we do something about are keys if you're going to be an effective purveyor of peace in this very complicated world.
That's wonderfully said. And, I'm going to maybe ask you from a different angle, because I think it's so critically important. If we're a peacemaker, if we're just human beings, or if we're professionals or whatever, we are constantly engaged in conversations with people that have different viewpoints about different things. It could be race, could be climate change, it could be politics or whatever. So we're constantly in this kind of interchange between in the world of ideas and the world of conversation. What is it we need to keep in mind for ourselves? I mean, you alluded to all these kind of things, but I just want to get you to sort of maybe amplify a little bit. So, I mean, here I am. Let's say I go to a Republican convention or something like that. I just happen to be there for whatever reason. Already, I've got my sort of backup or something like that. How can I go into that and sort of just be an effective human being without being somebody that's just trying to essentially put people in their place and get them to see things like I do?
Got it. Well, it's so funny. You're raising that question like that. It makes me think of a third challenge of being a peace builder, which I didn't articulate before. And that has to do with the striking the right balance between urgency and patience. And in a world full of conflict that seems to be headed toward destruction, if aliens were looking at us, they say, why are these people destroying their home, right? So we need to, on the one hand, we need to have some sense of urgency because, with the sort of increasing pace of technology and our own destructiveness, it is more and more possible for us to really undermine humanity's future. So that is true. We need to be urgent. At the same time, the problems of people being in conflict and the problems of inequities, et cetera, they're long in the making and they're likely to be long in the undoing. And so one of the things that can be a problem is that when people come into a situation and they too much want to put the fire out today. So what can that look like? So you go to the Republican convention, if you're a liberal person, and you see everybody there as like these people are undermining America. They're leading the country to self-destruction. I have to go fight them now, right? And I get that, but that energy is not going to help you connect with people. So as I try to tell people that, I have a product that I've been trying to promote this, and this I'll link this all back. It's called the Connection Trumps Conflict Holiday Survive and Thrive Guide. So it's basically a guide how to talk about current issues in the news across ideological lines. It's like a webinar and some worksheets so people can have some sense of how to do that. Some of the same concepts we've been talking about. So as been trying to promote that on TV and stuff. And what I tell people is that what's important to do is when you're in this kind of situation, you want to be, don't be a soldier, be a spy, right? So what you're trying to do is to understand other points of view. When you bring the energy of, I got to quash you, you are a fire that I have to put out. You are an enemy I have to squash. You don't build understanding. But if you have a different kind of a patience, so spies in war, there's a war, but they're a spy. So they're trying to understand. So they're bringing a whole different level of patience to this encounter with this human being right in front of them. They're listening. They're trying to be empathetic to try to understand, even if their overall goal is to get together their strategy so that they can squash that point of view. They're not trying to squash that view in that person. They're trying to understand it. And so that creates a whole different kind of a spirit to that encounter. So, and you see how it links back to the balance between like urgency and patience, right? We need to be committed to solving the crisis of conflict and global self-destruction and all of that. But at the same time, we need to bring the human being in front of us a kind of a patience and a recognition that if I squashing this person is not going to solve that problem. If they're a fire, right? I mean, it's the difference between, and I say this in the video, it's one thing if you're a firefighter and there's a fire in front of you, you want to put it out. But if you're in if you're surrounded by fires, then you might need to say, okay, I'm surrounded by fires. What I need to do is to understand how these fires are getting constructed. I don't need to spend all my energy trying to fight a fire because there's a zillion fires around. I need to understand what that is. So that balance between urgency and patience is an important thing to strike, and important if you're going to that kind of setting in which people look at the world very differently than you.
Wonderfully said. A couple of maybe final questions just to sort of bring it back to the personal here. So I'm just wondering, David, who are your sort of role models in terms of the work that you do?
Oh my. Well, one of my role models is Carolyn Lucasmeyer. Carolyn Lucasmeyer started America Speaks. And I used to work for them for quite a while. They no longer exist. But that was a group that I trained. That's a group from which I got a lot of understanding about what does large-scale dialogue and large-scale civic engagement mean. So their specialty, as you may or may not know, was these large convenings, like 500 people, 1,000 people, 5,000 people, all talking in small groups and using technology to bring those groups together. So to using technology to make sure that people had both a small group experience, that's a process issue, and then use technology to make sure that there's a coherent large group result. So they would use various technologies to bring the results of small group conversations together in one coherent place, then have a process for theming that, and then they use electronic audience polling keypads, which I've become like a renowned specialist in that. Not renowned, I've become a very accomplished specialist. I need to be more renowned on that. Because I think that they're a transformative force in meetings because of what they produce. But they perfected the engineering of this kind of dialogic process that is infinitely scalable, where everybody has a human scale experience, but there's a collective conclusion that you can hang your hat on. So her management of that organization over the years, she did that. Not only did she grow an organization, again, it doesn't exist anymore, but that organization was very important. And she was able to create settings through, it's not just her, but she would create settings in which, like, it's 3,000 people, but like there's a lot of love in the room, and there's a spirit of we're going to care for everybody here, everybody counts, and that experience is really that's critical to making people feel like connected to processes. But I admire her for the way she would convey that spirit of everybody. Everybody matters, and we're going to operate in this large scale environment in a way that reflects that. And so she is certainly a role model. And I aspire to create some institution that is as significant going forward as hers was in the past.
Last question, David. This is it's a pretty tough time that we're living in by a lot of measures. And so on a personal level, what are some strategies you use with yourself to be hopeful and to basically believe in the goodness and potential of humanity?
Whoa, dude, that's heavy. Let's see. What do I do for that? Because you're asking the beyond just the self-care question. I think the self-care question, which I'm not sure I pursue enough, but certainly, I try to do a little meditative walk most mornings. I try to think about like my parents' death. They're still alive. I think about my own death. I try to like, be in this, think about that, and then try to be in a stance of gratitude. And so that's a self-care question. There's a whole bunch of ways that people meditate. I'm not sure my way is super effective, but I'm just saying that is a self-care strategy to try to stay in a certain place of being centered. We're going to the question of believing in humanity. I'm not sure what I do. I mean, I think I have I think I have an ingrained belief in that. And I think that there's also just the issue of, what else are you going to do? right? So I'm not sure, like, if I didn't believe in humanity, okay, what does that mean? Like, first of all, I still got to live out the rest of my life. And then second, and I have a certain skill set that I need to do. Now I can, is it likely to work? I don't know, but I certainly have to try to do that. Sometimes, it's like sometimes you have to make, I guess in my feeling, the whole notion of like despairing so much you don't try, like that doesn't, I'm just not built for that. So I wish I could give better advice about what people can do. I mean, I think, I know that some people, they try to look at videos that inspire them. There's that, but just to be honest, I don't think I have a conscious strategy to bolster my empathy or belief. I think that at some levels, you maybe the practice is allow yourself to feel it when you feel it, right? So when that happens, don't run from that feeling. Let that feeling inspire you, because we make choices about that. Like you can cut off certain feelings, or you can choose to not cut them off. And so I think that a decision is whether you let yourself feel it when you are feeling it.
Well, David, I kind of got you going there, and what I appreciate especially is that you did lead with the self-care, and that's an important piece. And basically, to make a long story short, you're just sort of constitutionally inclined to be optimistic. Is kind of one way to answer the question.
I think that's right.
I'm going to leave in the show notes ways for people to contact you if they want to follow up with you on any of these things. But I want to just sort of thank you, David, for taking the time to talk with me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to, sharing a little bit about what you're about. And I'd like to invite people, if they enjoy the podcast, to rate us on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And also, if you want to support the podcast, you can go to Patreon and look for Diversity and Spirituality Network. And there's a way for you to support and to be a sponsor of the podcast if that's what you choose. And David, again, thank you very much for being my guest today. And I hope to be in touch with you in the future.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality?